Section A.6 is solving equations. An equation is two expressions separated with an equal sign, usually having a variable in there. A solution to an equation are values that make that equation true. So some important things that will be helpful is the zero product property. If you have two things multiplied together or more than two things multiplied together set equal to 0, note it's the zero product property. This only works when it's equal to 0. Then one or both of those have to be equal to 0. And then the last one is the quadratic formula. So if you have something a quadratic trinomial, ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, then x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This is helpful if your quadratic equation doesn't factor. So first, a little review for solving linear equations. So we have this linear equation, 8x minus the quantity 2x plus 1 equals 3x minus 10. So we solve linear equations by isolating the variables using reverse order of operations. So go ahead and pause the video and solve for x. So first I distribute this negative sign, make sure it goes to both parts in the parentheses. So you get 8x minus 2x minus 1 equals 3x minus 10, combine like terms. Then I moved everything with an x to one side, everything without an x to the other side, and you end up with 3x equals negative 9. Divide both sides by 3, you end up with x equals negative 3. Solving quadratic equations. So when we solve quadratic equations, the very first thing you want to do is set one side equal to 0, and then you want to check to see if it factors. If it does factor, factor it. If not, we're going to use quadratic formula. So go ahead and pause the video, set one side equal to 0, and factor this equation if it factors. So first I added 2 to both sides to make one side equal to 0, and then I factored this 3x plus 3x squared plus 5x plus 2 factors into 3x plus 2 times x plus 1. 3 can only be 3 times 1. 2 can be 2 times 1, and you want to figure out where to place it. We want this to be 3 plus 2 to equal 5, so this is how it's going to factor. So now we're going to use the zero product property. So the zero product property says if you have two or more things multiplied together equal to 0, then one or both of them has to equal 0. So we're going to get 3x plus 2 must equal 0, or x plus 1 must equal 0. So now we have two linear equations. Go ahead and pause the video and solve for x. So I set both sides equal to 0, and you end up with x is equal to negative 2/3, or x is equal to a negative 1. This only works when one side is equal to 0. It's a zero product property, not any number you choose product property. So one side must equal 0 for this to be true. So here's a similar one, 3x squared equals 5x minus 1. So I want you to go through the same process. If it doesn't factor, then you can use the quadratic formula that we showed on the first slide. So first I set one side equal to 0, so you get 3x squared minus 5x plus 1 is equal to 0. This does not factor, so I use quadratic formula, and I end up with 5 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 6. Don't plug this in your calculator. Just leave this in exact form, which is with the square root. This is perfectly acceptable final answer. So we're going to learn how to solve higher order polynomial equations a little bit later on, what happens when they don't factor. But if we have something like this that factors by grouping, then we can use our zero product property like we did before. So go ahead and pause the video. This already set equal to 0, factor it, and solve using the zero product property. So one side's already set equal to 0, so I factor this by grouping. You get x squared minus 4 times x minus 1 is equal to 0. You could actually notice that this does factor further. X squared minus 4 is a perfect square minus a perfect square. Factors into x plus 2 times x minus 2. Either way, use zero product property. So on this side here, I have x squared minus 4 is equal to 0, and x minus 1 is equal to 0. So I added 4 to both sides, and I took the square root. When I physically take the square root, I have to remember to do a plus or minus. So you get x is equal to plus or minus 2, because 2 squared is 4, and negative 2 quantity squared is also 4. Here you get x equals 1. If you had factored it again, you would have ended up with the same three answers. You just would have had these two as separate zero product properties. Solving absolute value equations. When you solve an absolute value equation, first you want to isolate the absolute value. For this example here, there is nothing attached to the outside of the absolute value. If there was, you would want to get rid of that first. Just what's on the outside of the absolute value. And then from here, once you have an absolute value equal to a positive number, If you have an absolute value equal to a negative number, that's not possible, there's no solution. So once you have an absolute value equal to a positive number, you're going to set up two equations. You want to think about, what can I take the absolute value of and get 13? Well, one thing I can take the absolute value of and get 13 would just be the number 13. So that means what's inside this absolute value could be equal to 13. The other thing that I can take the absolute value of and get a positive 13 is negative 13. The absolute value of negative 13 is equal to positive 13. So that means the inside of this absolute value could be equal to negative 13. So you're going to take what's inside the absolute value and set it equal to the positive of what's on your right on the other side, or also the negative on what's on that side. So go ahead and pause the video now and solve for x. So you end up with x equals 9 or x equals negative 17. 9 plus 4 is 13. Absolute value of 13 is 13. Negative 17 plus 4 is negative 13. Absolute value of negative 13 is positive 13. The last type we're going to look at is solving square root equations. So first thing, just like the absolute value, you would isolate the square root, just what's on the outside of the square root. So if there's anything add, subtract, multiplied, or divided to the outside of the square root, then you square both sides. If you have more than one square root, you isolate one of those square roots, square both sides, and then repeat the process if necessary. Then solve for x. And you always have to check for extraneous solutions on square root equations. So go ahead and pause the video and solve this equation for x. So first I isolated the square root by subtracting 2 from both sides. Now I have the square root by itself, so I squared both sides of the equation. The square root and the square cancel each other out. You're left with just 2x minus 3. 5 squared is 25. Now I just have a linear equation, so I solve that and I get x equals 14. Because of the nature of square root equations, the fact that we are changing it from a square root to not a square root means you must check for extraneous or extra solutions. So whatever you get, sometimes you might get more than one answer, plug that back into the very original equation and check to see if it works. If it works, it's a solution. If it does not work, it's what we call extraneous and is not an answer. So this has been solving equations by hand. Make sure you do know how to do all of these methods of solving equations.